Blood smeared across the cold metal floor of the Dawnbreaker as I clutched my husband's broken spectacles, my entire body shaking, because up until that moment, I genuinely believed he was the weakest thing on this ship. Everyone in my galactic sector knew the truth about humans. They needed perfect temperature control. Their skin bruised under standard gravity. A steep corridor left them winded for minutes. For 4 years of marriage, I had cradled my quiet, bookish husband away from every threat I could see, until the night the Void Syndicate punched through our hull. That night, I discovered something the galactic database had somehow buried. Thomas wasn't fragile. He was hiding. And he wasn't protecting himself from the universe. He was protecting the universe from himself. Let me rewind so you understand. Without the context, what happened aboard the Dawnbreaker will sound like a bad dream. My name is Serena. I belong to a species the galaxy calls the stone-burn dense, tall, built like walking granite. I stand just over 6'7". My skin is layered with natural keratin armor. A maintenance tool bounced off my shoulder barely registers. When I first introduced Thomas to my family on our colony world, my brother Corin actually choked on his drink. Not cruelty. Just shock. Thomas is 5'8". He weighed maybe 150 pounds soaking wet. His skin was so thin I could trace the blue rivers of his veins beneath it, especially at his throat and wrists. We met aboard the CSS Starwalker, a long-haul freighter run by a woman named Captain Voss. Thomas served as the ship's senior data archivist. He lived in the climate-controlled server room, wrapped in a heavy knitted cardigan, even when the thermostat hit what I considered a roasting 72 degrees. He was always cold, always sniffling. A minor adjustment to the recycled air left him bedridden for 2 days with what humans call a head cold. I fell in love with his mind. He was brilliant, gentle. He listened to me rant for hours without interrupting, rubbing my shoulders with those absurdly warm, soft hands. But my protective instincts never turned off. About 18 months into our marriage, an incident crystallized everything. We were in the cargo hold. Thomas dropped a 4-pound diagnostic tool directly onto his foot. The noise he made, a sharp, gasping cry, sent me sprinting across the deck. He hopped on one leg, his face draining to a sickly green. The ship's doctor, a woman named Chun, had to splint his toe because the minor impact had cracked the bone. A 4-pound tool. I remember thinking, if a cargo container shifts during turbulence, it will literally crush him. From that day forward, I treated him like crystal. I opened every heavy door. I carried all our luggage during shore leave. If a cantina got rowdy, I stepped in front of him immediately, shielding his delicate frame with my own bulk. He never argued. He just adjusted his round spectacles, offered an apologetic smile to anyone jostling us, and squeezed my hand in quiet thanks. He told me he grew up in a place called Greenfield, a sleepy suburban town on Earth. He claimed he'd been a tax analyst before chasing the stars. He loved classical music, tended the ship's hydroponic garden, and read physical books with cracked spines. The only time I questioned his story was when I noticed faded, jagged scars across his left shoulder. When I asked, he smiled sheepishly and said he fell out of a tree as a teenager. Given that a dropped tool had fractured his foot, I believed him completely. My friend Leona, the ship's quartermaster, used to tease me. "Serena," she'd laugh over synthetic coffee, "you didn't marry a man. You adopted a very clever, very fragile houseplant." I'd get defensive, but part of me agreed. I loved protecting him. I loved being needed. It gave my life a shape I hadn't known I was missing. The Galactic Council classifies Earth as a Category 3 death world. But every time I watched Thomas sneeze because someone opened a spice packet too aggressively, I assumed the Council's bureaucrats had made an enormous clerical error. Humans were soft. They were breakable. That was the immutable law of my universe. Right up until the boarding sirens began to scream. The Starwalker was 3 days out from the Saturn relay, coasting through a quiet zone in Sector 12 when the proximity alarms detonated. Not the usual rhythmic beep of a navigation hazard. A red protocol shriek. A high-pitched, skull-drilling scream tore through the ship, accompanied by strobing crimson emergency lights. I was in our quarters, folding Thomas's absurd collection of hand-knitted sweaters, while he sat at his desk studying a datapad and sipping herbal tea. The ship lurched violently. The inertial buffers failed to compensate in time, and I slammed against the wall. My density meant I just grunted. But Thomas was hurled completely out of his chair, crashing hard onto the metal deck. His tea shattered. "Thomas!" I yelled, scrambling to my feet and hauling him up. He was pale, his eyes blown wide with panic. He was shaking physically, his hands trembling so badly he couldn't push his glasses back up his nose. "What hit us?" he stammered, his voice cracking. The intercom crackled. Captain Voss's usually steady voice was tight with raw terror. "All hands, this is the captain. We are under attack by vessels belonging to the Void Syndicate. They've tethered to our hull. We are being boarded. All non-combat personnel retreat to the secure bunker in Section 7 immediately. Security teams repel boarders. May whatever gods you believe in help us all." My blood turned to ice. The Void Syndicate wasn't just pirates. They were butchers led by a warlord named Victor Crow. They took no prisoners unless the prisoners were bound for the slave markets. They were heavily augmented, utterly ruthless, and armed with plasma weaponry that could melt ship bulkheads like butter. "We have to move," I whispered, grabbing Thomas's arm. He felt so incredibly light, so delicate. His breathing was rapid and shallow. "Serena," he stuttered, staring at the door. "I'm scared." "I've got you," I promised, pushing him toward the corridor. "I won't let them touch you. Just stay behind me." We stepped into the hallway. Chaos. Crew members sprinted past. Chief Engineer Morrison ran by screaming into his cum to lock down the blast doors. The sound of heavy kinetic impacts echoed through the ship's frame. Boom, boom, boom. They were blowing the airlocks. I kept my body between Thomas and the direction of the boarding bays. Every time the ship shuddered, he flinched, shrinking into himself. He looked like a terrified child. I felt a surge of fierce, protective rage. If any of those syndicate monsters came near him, I would tear them apart with my bare hands. We reached Section 7. The secure bunker was just a reinforced cargo hold used for volatile minerals. About 30 crew members were already huddled inside, including Leona and Dr. Chun. The medical officer was treating a crewman whose arm had been badly burned by a ricocheting plasma bolt. I shoved Thomas into a corner behind a stack of heavy titanium crates. "Stay down," I ordered. "Do not move, no matter what you hear." Thomas nodded frantically, pulling his knees to his chest, wrapping his arms around his legs. He was trembling so hard his teeth chattered. I took a position in front of the crates, shoulder to shoulder with Leona. She held a heavy laser cutter. Her hands shook almost as badly as Thomas's. I had a metal pry bar I'd ripped off a wall mount. We were cargo crew, not soldiers. The security team numbered maybe 6 people. Through the thick metal of the bunker door, we heard gunfire. Screams echoed over the comm system until someone cut the feed. The silence that followed was worse. It meant the security team was gone. It meant Captain Voss was likely dead or captured. Then we heard heavy metallic footsteps approaching our sector, magnetic boots on deck plates. A cruel, deep laugh bled through the metal of our door. "Open up, little piggies," a distorted voice mocked through an external speaker. "The Void boys are here to collect." Nobody moved, nobody breathed. I glanced back at Thomas. He had his eyes squeezed shut, his hands clamped over his ears. I gritted my teeth, gripping my pry bar until my knuckles ached. A blinding blue light sparked at the center of the bunker door. A thermal lance. They were cutting through. The temperature spiked, smelling of ozone and melting steel. Molten slag dripped onto the floor, hissing. It's over, I thought. They're going to kill my gentle, fragile husband. The heavy bunker door didn't just open. It was kicked inward violently. The massive slab of metal, weighing at least a ton, groaned and slammed onto the deck. The sudden pressure change sucked smoke and heat out into the corridor, revealing the nightmare standing in the threshold. 5 of them. A mix of species, but all massive, clad in scarred combat armor. At their center stood Victor Crow, a terrifying brute, towering even over me, his face half replaced by crude cybernetics. He carried a heavy plasma repeater in one hand, like it was weightless. Well, well, Crow purred, stepping over the ruined door. Looks like we found the payload. Stay back, Leona screamed, raising the laser cutter. Before she could even power it on, the pirate to Crow's left, a massive reptilian alien named Drac, stepped forward and backhanded her. The sickening crack of bone echoed as Leona was sent flying, crashing into a bulkhead and slumping to the floor, unconscious. Leona, I screamed, stepping forward, my pry bar raised. Crow didn't even shoot me. He simply reached out, grabbed my wrist, and squeezed. My bones are incredibly dense, but the hydraulic servos in his cybernetic arm were stronger. I felt my wrist fracture, and I dropped the pry bar with a cry of pain. Crow shoved me backward. I stumbled and fell hard, landing right at the base of the crates where Thomas was hiding. He wasn't shaking from fear. He was fighting a war inside his own blood. Load him up, Crow ordered his men, gesturing to the terrified crew. Anyone who resists gets kneecapped. The big one here, he pointed at me, might fetch a good price in the mining pits. Drac walked over, grabbing me by the collar and hauling me upward. I struggled, kicking at him, but he was like a statue. He raised his heavy-plated fist to strike me. Please don't hurt her. The voice was thin, reedy, desperate. Drac paused, looking down. Thomas had scrambled out from behind the crates. He was on his knees, his glasses askew, looking up at the towering, heavily armed pirates. He looked so pathetic, so utterly defenseless. Thomas, no. Stay back, I sobbed, struggling against Drac's grip. Crow looked at Thomas and burst into a booming laugh. What in the void is this? A human? I thought you fragile things stayed on your core worlds where it's safe. Please, Thomas begged, his hands raised in surrender. Take the cargo. Take whatever you want. Just let my wife go. Wife? Crow sneered, looking at me, then back at Thomas. She's your wife? That's hilarious. You couldn't satisfy a woman like this, let alone protect her. Crow stepped forward and casually kicked Thomas in the stomach. Not a full-force blow, but for a human, it was devastating. Thomas doubled over, gagging, coughing up a spray of bright red blood onto the deck. He collapsed onto his side, wheezing, clutching his ribs. Thomas! I screamed, thrashing wildly. Drac growled and struck me across the jaw. My vision swam, black spots dancing, but I forced myself to stay conscious. I had to watch. I couldn't let him die alone. Crow stood over Thomas, pointing the barrel of his plasma repeater at my husband's head. Pathetic, he spat. I'll do you a favor, human. I'll put you out of your misery before I take your woman. Thomas was still on the floor, curled into a fetal position, completely still. The bunker was dead silent, save for the hum of the pirate's armor and the terrified sobbing of the crew. Then Thomas let out a breath, not a gasp of pain. A long, slow, measured exhale. His hand, the one that had been shaking violently minutes ago, reached up. He grabbed his bent glasses. Very calmly, he pulled them off, folded them neatly, and placed them gently on the floor beside him. When he stood up, the man who rose from the deck didn't look like my husband. Physically, it was him. But the posture was entirely different. The soft, hunched shoulders rolled back. His spine straightened. He seemed taller, wider, But the most terrifying change was his eyes. Thomas's pupils had dilated so massively that his eyes looked almost entirely black. The veins in his neck, the ones I thought looked so fragile, were now bulging, thick and dark. He wasn't shaking anymore. His body was unnaturally still. I didn't know it at the time, but I was witnessing an evolutionary failsafe unique to humanity. An endocrine phenomenon called an adrenaline cascade. The shaking Thomas had been experiencing wasn't fear. It was his nervous system violently trying to restrain an ancient prehistoric predator locked away in his DNA. And Crow had just kicked the cage open. Crow frowned, confused by the sudden shift. "What are you looking at, meat?" he barked, raising the gun. Thomas didn't speak. He moved, not like a fragile data analyst. He moved with a sudden explosive velocity that my eyes struggled to track. In a fraction of a second, Thomas closed the distance. Before Crow could even pull the trigger, Thomas's hand shot out. He didn't punch. He struck with an open palm, aimed perfectly at the underside of Crow's jaw, bypassing the heavy armor. The impact sounded like a gunshot. The sheer kinetic force snapped Crow's head back with such violence that a sickening crunch echoed. The warlord's eyes rolled back. The massive brute, weighing over 300 pounds in armor, was lifted inches off the deck before crashing backward, dead before he hit the ground. His cervical vertebrae had been completely shattered. The silence that followed was absolute. Drac dropped me, staring at his dead boss in disbelief. The rest of the pirates froze. Thomas slowly turned his head. The soft gentleman who needed me to open jars for him looked at the remaining 4 heavily armed pirates. He didn't look frightened. He looked annoyed. He wiped a smear of blood from his mouth with the back of his hand, spat on the floor, and spoke in a voice utterly unrecognizable, deep, guttural, entirely devoid of emotion. "Who's next?" For 3 seconds, the universe simply stopped. The crew stopped crying. The structural groans of the Starwalker faded to white noise. There was only the crumpled mass of Crow on the deck, and my husband standing over him, rolling his shoulders with the terrifying loose grace of an apex predator unchained. Drac was the first to break. The massive reptilian let out a guttural hissing roar and drew a jagged vibro machete from his thigh sheath. He lunged at Thomas. Drac weighed upwards of 400 pounds, covered in overlapping scales that could deflect low-caliber rounds. But what the galaxy failed to understand about Earth was the mechanical trade-off of their evolution. They didn't have exoskeletons or dense keratin plates. Their bodies prioritized something far more lethal, unadulterated explosive kinetic velocity. Thomas didn't scramble backward. He stepped into the charge, a maneuver that defied every instinct of self-preservation known to civilized species. As Drac brought the humming machete down in a vicious arc, Thomas simply wasn't there anymore. He pivoted on his heel, dropping his center of gravity with shocking speed, letting the blade cleave through empty air inches from his face. Before Drac could arrest his momentum, Thomas drove his fist directly into the side of the reptilian's knee joint. The muscles I had thought were soft contracted into steel cables. The impact sounded like a wooden beam snapping. Drac shrieked as his knee inverted backward. The giant collapsed, but Thomas wasn't finished. This wasn't a brawl. It was a systematic dismantling. I later learned from Thomas's classified Earth Coalition personnel file that he had spent 12 years in Joint Special Operations Command, specifically a Tier 1 unit operating out of a pre-unification military base called Fort Bragg. His scars from falling out of a tree were actually shrapnel wounds from a fragmentation grenade during the siege of the Orion Belt. He wasn't a tax analyst. He was a retired wet work specialist who had sought out the quietest corner of the galaxy to escape a lifetime of bloodshed. And now the Void Syndicate had brought the blood to him. As Drac pitched forward screaming, Thomas grabbed his thick wrist. With a brutal twisting wrench, he dislocated Drac's shoulder. The machete clattered. Thomas drove his elbow downward, crushing the reptilian's throat. Drax's shrieks turned into a wet gurgle as he hit the floor. 2 down, 3 left. Elapsed time, roughly 6 seconds. The remaining 3 pirates finally snapped out of their stupor. They were seasoned killers, heavily modified and armed to the teeth. But they were suddenly backing away toward the ruined bunker door, their ocular implants wide with panic. The narrative they had been sold their entire lives, that humans were pathetic, squishy targets, was evaporating in front of their eyes. Shoot him or burn him to ash. The ranking pirate, a 4-armed synthetic hybrid, screamed. They raised their heavy plasma repeaters. The air superheated as the weapons wound up, charging their magnetic coils. Thomas didn't try to outrun the plasma. He reached down. His fingers wrapped around the handle of the metal pry bar I had dropped when Crow broke my wrist. It weighed nearly 15 pounds, a dense rod of cold-forged titanium. I struggled to swing it with one hand. Thomas picked it up effortlessly. He didn't wield it like a club. He hefted it over his shoulder, his entire body coiling backward like a tightly wound industrial spring. Humans evolved by hunting game on the open savannas of Earth. Long before lasers or firearms, they survived by doing something no other species in the galaxy can do with any accuracy. They throw things. The mammalian brain possesses a terrifying hardwired capacity for instantaneous ballistic calculus. Thomas hurled the titanium pry bar. It left his hand with the concussive crack of a sonic boom. The metal rod crossed 20 feet of open space in a gray blur, striking the 4-armed pirate dead center in the chest before he could pull his trigger. The kinetic energy shattered his chest plating, driving him backward off his feet and pinning him against the corridor bulkhead. Dead instantly. The 2 remaining Syndicate thugs opened fire. Streaks of blinding plasma tore through the bunker. The heavy crates behind Thomas exploded in showers of molten slag. But my husband was already moving. The bunker erupted into chaos. Plasma bolts hissed through the air, flashing against the walls, filling the room with the acrid stench of melted titanium. The civilian crew huddled tighter, screaming, pressing themselves flat against the deck. I lay frozen near Thomas's folded glasses, clutching my fractured wrist. My eyes frantically tracked my husband. I expected him to be vaporized at any moment. But Thomas was a phantom. The Starwalker generated gravity at 0.8 gigaseconds, a standard setting for a mixed-species crew. To me, it felt normal. To a human who grew up in the crushing 1G environment of Earth, it was like fighting underwater. Thomas wasn't just faster. He was operating under a massive gravitational handicap that worked entirely in his favor. Every step covered twice the distance the aliens anticipated. Every leap carried him higher. He dove forward in a tactical roll, passing completely beneath a barrage of plasma fire. As he came out of the roll, his hand swept over the deck, snatching up the heavy plasma sidearm that had fallen from Crow's holster. The weapon was designed for a hand twice the size of a human's, heavily modified, devoid of standard safety interlocks. Yet Thomas gripped it with both hands, finding his stance with mechanical precision. He didn't fire wildly. Pop, pop. 2 brilliant blue streaks lashed out. The first struck the left pirate directly in his helmet visor. The superheated plasma vaporized the reinforced glass and whatever lay behind it. The pirate dropped like a stone. The second shot caught the final pirate in the right shoulder, severing his arm at the joint. The heavy repeater clattered, and the alien fell to his knees screaming. The deafening roar of weapons fire ceased. The sudden silence was heavy, thick with the smell of death and ozone. Thomas stood in the center of the carnage. His chest heaved, drawing massive ragged breaths. The adrenaline still pumped through him, evident in the rigid tension of his jaw and the feral blackness of his eyes. He kept the heavy plasma pistol leveled directly at the head of the surviving 1-armed pirate kneeling in the hallway. "Please," the pirate whimpered. "I yield. I yield by syndicate law. Don't. Thomas didn't say a word. He simply squeezed the trigger. Pop! The pirate's head snapped back and collapsed. Thomas slowly lowered the weapon. He stood motionless for a long moment, staring out into the empty smoke-filled corridor, listening for more boarding boots. The only sound was the distant thud of the ship's automated defense turrets and the weeping of the crew behind him. Slowly, agonizingly, the apex predator began to retreat back into its cage. I watched the physical transformation happen in reverse. The iron tension in his shoulders dropped. The terrifying rigidity of his spine softened. The thick pulsing veins began to recede, and then the shaking returned. Not a tremble this time, a violent full-body shudder. The adrenaline dump was wearing off, leaving behind a catastrophic crash. The human body is capable of miraculous destruction, but the biochemical cost of running at 200% capacity is devastating. Thomas dropped the plasma pistol. It clattered heavily. He swayed on his feet, his knees buckling. He looked down at his hands, covered in Drax's blood, and let out a shaky breath. "Serena," he whispered. His voice was no longer that guttural bark. It was the thin, reedy, gentle voice of my husband. I scrambled up, cradling my broken wrist, and ran to him. I didn't care about the blood or the bodies, or the fact that I had just watched him slaughter 5 heavily, armed enforcers in under 20 seconds. I threw my good arm around his waist, catching him as his legs gave out. He was so heavy, denser than he looked. We collapsed to our knees together. "I've got you," I sobbed, pressing my face into his shoulder. "I'm here. I'm okay." He buried his face in my neck, his hands clutching desperately at my tunic. He shook so violently, my teeth rattled. "I'm sorry," he gasped. "Serena, I'm so sorry. I didn't want you to see that. I promised myself I'd never be that thing again." I murmured, rocking him. "You saved us." "You saved me?" Dr. Chun emerged from the back of the bunker, stepping gingerly over the bodies. Her medical scanner was already in her hand, her eyes wide with terror and awe. "By the stars," Chun whispered. "Is he wounded?" I looked at Thomas. During the frantic combat, a near-miss plasma bolt had grazed his left bicep, burning through his sweater and leaving an angry blistered furrow of 3rd-degree burns. Earlier, when he dropped a tool on his foot, he had nearly passed out from the pain. Now, looking at a wound that would require synthetic skin grafts, he barely seemed to notice it. "He's burned," I said, my voice trembling. Thomas looked down at his arm, as if it belonged to someone else. He blinked, the deep black of his pupils finally receding to reveal his familiar soft brown eyes. He reached up with a bloody, shaking hand, trying to pull the ruined fabric over the burn. "It's ruined," he mumbled deliriously. "You just folded this one. I really like this sweater." A tear slipped down my hardened cheek. The terrifying monster that had just painted the deck with alien blood was gone. My gentle, fragile, ridiculous husband was back, mourning a piece of knitwear while standing in a slaughterhouse. I reached down and picked up his glasses from the floor. Slightly bent, but unbroken, I gently slid them back onto his face. "I'll knit you a new one," I promised, kissing his forehead. The monster was back in its cage, locked behind wire rims and a love for terrible sweaters. The fight wasn't over. The Starwalker was still under attack, and Captain Voss's fate was still unknown. But as I held the shaking human in my arms, looking at the devastation he had wrought, I felt a strange peace. The Void Syndicate had boarded the wrong ship. They had kicked the wrong door. Because out there in the cold vacuum of space, humanity wasn't a fragile species needing protection. They were the apex predators of the cosmos, patiently wearing wool sweaters and waiting for a reason to take their glasses off. Dr. Chun's hands shook as she applied a thick layer of military-grade coagulant foam to Thomas's burn. The gel hissed, bubbling as it sealed the charred flesh. Thomas winced, but didn't make a sound. The violent shaking of his post-adrenaline crash had subsided into a low, steady tremor. The bunker was quiet now, save for muffled sobs. Leona was awake, clutching her makeshift splint, her eyes darting between the ruined door and my husband. Everyone was looking at him differently. They didn't see the quiet archivist anymore. They saw the ghost of Earth's violent history standing right in front of them. "We can't stay here," Thomas said, his voice returning to its normal pitch, though it carried a new authority. He pulled the ruined edges of his sweater together. "Crow's check-in window will expire soon. When his comes stay silent, the rest of the boarding party will converge on Section 7. Where do we go?" Dr. Chun asked. "The escape pods in Section 4 were blown when they breached the hull. We're trapped." "The bridge," Thomas replied, looking at me. "Captain Voss is still up there. If they haven't killed her yet, they're torturing her for the navigation codes. They want the ship intact. If we retake the bridge, I can lock down the internal bulkheads and vent the remaining corridors. Flush the rest out like rats." I stared at him. The casual, clinical way he suggested venting living beings into the void sent a chill down my spine. "Thomas," I said gently, touching his good shoulder, "you're hurt. You're exhausted. You can barely stand." He looked up at me, adjusting his bent glasses. The softness was back in his eyes, but beneath it lay a cold steel I had never recognized. Serena, on Earth, my unit was deployed to a region called the Kunar Province. Mountains, rock, hostile fire. We were pinned for 3 days without sleep, operating on fast-twitch muscle fibers and spite. "I'm perfectly fine." He bent down and retrieved the massive plasma pistol, checking the thermal magazine. Then he walked to Crow's corpse, unlatched the warlord's heavy kinetic sidearm, a brutal weapon firing depleted uranium slugs, and tucked it into his waistband. "Stay here," Thomas instructed the crew. "Barricade the door with those titanium crates. If anyone other than us tries to come through, use the laser cutter. Do not hesitate." "I'm coming with you," I said, stepping forward. Thomas opened his mouth to argue, but saw the look on my face. The Stoneburn are stubborn. My wrist was broken, but my legs were fine, and my remaining arm was still strong enough to crush a cinder block. More importantly, he was my husband. Apex predator or not, I wasn't letting him walk into that dark hallway alone. He gave a sharp nod. "Keep behind me. Stay out of the center of the corridor." Back to the bulkhead, we left the bunker. Stepping over the ruined bodies, the Starwalker felt like a ghost ship. Emergency strobes bathed the long corridors in rhythmic crimson flashes. The air scrubbers were failing, leaving the atmosphere thick with smoke, copper, and burnt insulation. As we moved, Thomas transformed again. He didn't sprint. He moved with terrifying fluid stealth. For a human wearing standard ship-issue loafers, he made absolutely no sound on the metal grating. He sliced the pie at every corner, a pre-unification Earth military tactic, using angles to maximize line of sight before exposing his body. I, towering over him, felt like a loud, clumsy giant clanking along behind a shadow. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered as we paused by a maintenance junction. Thomas didn't look back. "Because I hated him, Serena, the man I used to be. When you grow up on a death world, violence isn't a choice, it's a currency. The Earth Coalition trained me to be a scalpel. I spent 12 years cutting out the galaxy's tumors. But every time you kill, a piece of your humanity stays behind with the corpse. Then I met you. You treated me like something fragile, something worth protecting. I liked that. I wanted to be that." He raised his hand, balling it into a fist, a tactical signal. I froze instantly. From the cross corridor ahead, heavy magnetic boots echoed. 3 more Syndicate pirates, led by a towering brute with a thermal lance, marched toward our intersection. 3 targets. Heavy armor, Thomas murmured. He looked at the kinetic pistol, then at the plasma pistol. He holstered the plasma weapon and drew the slug thrower. "They have kinetic shielding," I warned softly. "Slugs won't penetrate." "I know," Thomas whispered. His eyes darted upward. Running along the top of the bulkhead was a massive high-pressure coolant pipe for the ship's secondary reactor, marked with yellow and black hazard stripes. Shields stop fast-moving projectiles. They don't stop ambient environmental hazards. He stepped out from cover, completely exposing himself in the middle of the hallway. The pirates stopped dead, raising their weapons. "Hey," the leader barked. "Got a stray human here." Thomas didn't aim at them. He raised the kinetic pistol at a 45-degree angle toward the ceiling and pulled the trigger 3 times. The recoil pushed him backward half a step, but his grip held. The depleted uranium slugs tore through the hardened casing of the coolant pipe directly above the pirates' heads. Liquid nitrogen and specialized chemicals, pressurized at 3,000 psi, violently erupted. The temperature in the corridor instantly plummeted to hundreds of degrees below zero. The pirates shrieked as the sub-zero liquid cascaded over them. Their kinetic shields ignored the liquid. Their heavy combat armor, designed to dissipate plasma heat, instantly froze solid. The mechanical servos in their joints locked up. In less than 3 seconds, the 3 heavily armed killers were turned into rigid frost-covered statues, suffocating as the cold seized their lungs. Thomas casually walked past the frozen, groaning pirates, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He adjusted his glasses and gestured for me to follow. "Come on, the bridge is only 2 decks up." I hurried after him, my heart hammering. I had spent 4 years terrified the universe would break my husband. I was only beginning to realize that if provoked, my husband could break the universe. The blast doors to the Starwalker's command bridge were sealed shut, marked by deep glowing scars where the Syndicate had tried to use a thermal cutter. They had failed. Captain Voss had engaged the heavy lockdown bolts from inside. But the pirates had found another way. The external observation glass, designed to withstand micrometeorite impacts, had been blown out by a shaped breaching charge, creating a jagged hole into the command center. We crouched behind a ventilation stack on the upper gantry, looking down through the shattered viewport. The bridge was a disaster. Primary consoles sparked. Emergency lighting cast long shadows. Captain Voss, a grizzled Arcturan with graying fur, was on her knees, bleeding heavily from a temple wound. Standing over her was the Syndicate lieutenant, a humanoid cyborg named Marcus, notorious in the Outer Rim. His right arm was a fully integrated pulse cannon, his left eye a glowing red targeting optic. 3 other heavily armed guards flanked him, holding the surviving bridge crew at gunpoint. "I will ask you one last time, Voss," Marcus hissed, pressing the hot barrel of his pulse cannon against the captain's forehead. "The command overrides. Give them to me, or I start spacing your crew 1 piece at a time." Voss spat blood onto the deck. "Go to hell, Marcus. You get the codes. You kill us anyway." "I'm not giving you my ship." Marcus sighed a metallic synthesized sound. "Suit yourself." He turned his pulse cannon toward the young ensign, who whimpered and squeezed his eyes shut. Up in the gantry, Thomas touched my shoulder. "I'm going through the maintenance chute," he whispered, pointing to a narrow 18-inch ventilation grate above the bridge's tactical display. "It drops right behind the captain's chair." I stared at the tiny grate. "Thomas, you can't fit in there." "It's too small." He offered a grim smile. "Humans evolved as persistence hunters, Serena. But before we learned to run down mammoths, we survived by hiding in caves and squeezing into holes where bigger monsters couldn't follow. My collarbones can articulate." "I'll fit." He handed me the heavy kinetic pistol. "When I drop, they'll turn their weapons on me. I need you to provide covering fire through the viewport. You don't have to hit them. Just make them flinch. Thomas, there are 4 of them. You only have the plasma pistol." "They won't," he interrupted, his eyes locking onto mine with burning intensity. "Because I'm going to do something completely irrational. Just trust me." Before I could argue, he slipped away, prying open the gantry grating and disappearing into the cramped ventilation duct. I was left alone, holding a hand cannon that weighed as much as a small dog, my broken wrist throbbing. Down on the bridge, Marcus's weapon hummed to lethal maximum charge. "Say goodbye to your ensign, Captain." Suddenly, the heavy metal grating directly above Marcus's head gave way with a screech of tearing metal. Thomas didn't fall. He descended like a lightning strike. He dropped 15 feet, landing squarely on the shoulders of the guard, standing closest to Marcus. The sheer downward kinetic force of a 150-pound human falling from that height shattered the guard's collarbones, sending him collapsing to the floor. Thomas hit the deck rolling, coming up in a crouch behind the captain's chair. What in the void? Marcus roared, spinning around, his targeting optics struggling to track the intrusion. Now, I thought. I hauled the heavy kinetic pistol over the lip of the viewport, braced it with my good arm against my chest, and pulled the trigger. The weapon roared, sending a massive depleted uranium slug smashing into the bridge's main tactical console beside Marcus. The console exploded in sparks and glass. As the pirates flinched, Thomas moved. He didn't shoot. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small cylindrical object, a Class 4 plasma grenade stripped from Crow's belt. But Thomas didn't throw it. He slammed his thumb onto the arming mechanism. The grenade began to emit a high-pitched whine, glowing with an angry pulsating blue light. He held the armed live explosive directly in front of his own chest. "Nobody move." Thomas roared. His voice was no longer soft. It was the booming bark of a military commander, echoing off metal bulkheads with terrifying volume. Marcus and his guards froze, their weapons raised, but their fingers hesitating on the triggers. They stared at the human holding a live thermal explosive that would vaporize everything within 30 feet. "Are you insane?" Marcus shouted, taking a half-step back. "You'll kill us all. You'll vaporize yourself." Thomas stood perfectly straight, his face an impassive mask of cold fury. The blue light reflected off his wire-rimmed glasses. "I am a Terran," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. "My species spent 50 years holding our own homeworld hostage, with thousands of nuclear warheads, just to prove a point to ourselves. We practically invented mutually assured destruction. Do you really think I care if I die today?" He took a step forward. The grenade whined louder, counting down. "You want the ship?" Thomas challenged, taking another step. "Shoot me." The dead man switched triggers the second my thumb slips. The explosion will rupture the radiation dampeners beneath the floorboards. The core will go critical. You, your men, your ship tethered to our hull, and everything in a 10-mile radius will become a very bright star. Marcus's cybernetic eye whirred frantically, calculating blast radius, thermal output, and the sheer madness of the creature in front of him. In the Galactic Coalition, self-preservation was the baseline logic of every sentient species. No one bluffed with their own life. But looking into Thomas's cold, dead eyes, Marcus couldn't find a bluff. He just saw a void. "You're bluffing," Marcus hissed, though his voice lacked conviction. Thomas smiled. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. Not a smile of joy. The baring of teeth. 3 seconds, Thomas whispered. 2, Marcus broke. "Stand down." He screamed at his guards. "Drop your weapons. Drop them." Heavy rifles clattered to the floor. Marcus lowered his pulse cannon, holding his organic hand in the air. "Disarm the grenade," Marcus yelled, backing away. "We surrender." Thomas didn't disarm it. He kept his thumb clamped down. "Kick the weapons to the captain," he ordered. Marcus nodded frantically, kicking the rifles across the deck. Captain Voss, still bleeding and dazed, scrambled forward and grabbed one, leveling it at the pirates. "Serena," Thomas called out, not taking his eyes off Marcus. "Come down here and secure them." I climbed through the maintenance hatch and dropped onto the bridge, keeping the kinetic pistol aimed at Marcus's chest. I was shaking not from fear of the pirates, but from the suffocating tension of the live bomb in my husband's hand. Once the pirates were forced to the ground and zip-tied by the ensign, Thomas finally let out a long, slow breath. He pressed the secondary safety latch on the grenade. The terrifying line spooled down. The angry blue light faded to a dull, safe green. He slumped against the captain's chair, sliding to the floor, his head in his hands. "By the ancestors, Thomas," Captain Voss gasped, using a console to pull herself up. "I thought you were going to vaporize my bridge." That was the bravest, most insane bluff I've ever seen. Thomas looked up from his hands, his face pale, his glasses sliding down his nose. He looked at the captain with total exhaustion. "Captain," Thomas said softly, his voice trembling with the returning adrenaline crash. "The arming mechanism on a Syndicate plasma grenade requires a specialized encrypted biometric thumbprint to actually detonate. Crow's thumbprint." Voss blinked. "What are you saying?" Thomas held up the inert metal cylinder. "I'm saying it wasn't a live bomb. It was just an angry flashlight. If they had shot me, it would have just bounced off the floor." The bridge descended into stunned silence. Marcus, tied up on the deck, let out a howl of pure, enraged humiliation. I looked at my fragile, brilliant, terrifying human husband sitting on the deck in his ruined sweater, and I started to laugh. A chuckle that bubbled into a full-blown hysterical laugh of sheer relief. The Void Syndicate hadn't just been physically outmatched by a human. They had been intellectually dismantled by one. The universe thought he was glass, until he shattered and cut them all. The laughter finally subsided, leaving a ringing silence. Marcus lay hog-tied, weeping from psychological whiplash. My husband, the man who caught colds from ship air conditioning, had just checkmated a warlord with a glorified paperweight. But the Starwalker was still bleeding. "Captain," Thomas said, pulling himself up, "we have a tactical problem." Marcus was the vanguard, but the Syndicate's primary cruiser, the Bloodfang, is still tethered to our primary airlock. Their internal sensors will detect that Marcus's vitals have spiked and his comms are dark. "How many more?" Captain Voss asked. Thomas stepped to the shattered tactical console. His fingers, which I had only ever seen gently turning pages or pruning bonsai trees, began to fly across the holographic interface with terrifying speed. Thermal imaging shows 24 distinct heat signatures clustered in their forward boarding tube. They're waiting for Marcus's all clear. When they don't get it, they'll breach in force. "We don't have the manpower to repel 24 heavily armored shock troops." "Then we're dead anyway," the ensign whispered. "No," Thomas said softly, not a boast, a cold empirical statement. "They won't." He turned to me. "Serena, I need you to manually bypass the failsafe on the external umbilical clamps. The physical lever is under the tertiary floor grate. My hands, they're shaking too much to grip the maintenance wheel." He held up his hands. The adrenaline was gone, leaving his nerve system frayed. The tremor was violent, his fingers dancing uncontrollably. I nodded, dropped the kinetic pistol, and marched to the floor grate. With one good arm, I ripped the titanium grating out and reached down into the maintenance shaft, gripping the heavy manual release wheel. "I've got it," I grunted, muscles straining. "But Thomas, if I pull this, it won't sever the tether. The Bloodfang has a magnetic vice grip on our hull. We can't shake them loose." "We don't need to shake them loose," Thomas replied, fingers still flying. Back on Earth, my close-quarters instructor taught me a fundamental rule of asymmetric warfare. You never attack the enemy where they are strong. You turn their own strength into their executioner. He hit a final keystroke. The main holographic display shifted to the engineering readouts of the pirate cruiser. "What are you doing?" Marcus snarled from the floor. "You can't hack our mainframe. It's on a closed loop." "I'm not hacking your mainframe," Thomas said. "I'm routing a localized feedback surge to the physical data cable inside the boarding tether. Your engineers were sloppy. They left the umbilical diagnostic port open to unencrypted handshake protocols." He looked up, his brown eyes reflecting the cold blue light. Captain Voss, on my mark, engage reverse thrusters to maximum. Serena, when the captain hits the thrusters, pull that manual release wheel as hard as you can. What are you going to do? Voss asked. The Syndicate relies on localized gravity plating to keep their massive bodies moving in zero-G combat. I am going to invert the polarity of the Bloodfang's forward gravity generators. Turn their boarding tube from 1G to roughly 40 Gs. Marcus's cybernetic eye widened in horror. No, you'll crush them. You'll liquefy them. Mark, Thomas said. Captain Voss slammed the reverse thrusters. The Starwalker groaned, massive engines roaring to life, pulling against the pirate ship. Pull, Serena, Thomas shouted. I braced my boots against the deck plates, roared with exertion, and wrenched the maintenance wheel counterclockwise. The gears shrieked and gave way with a heavy metallic clunk. Internal clamps disengaged. At the exact same millisecond, Thomas hit execute. Through the viewport, we didn't see the pirate ship, but we felt it. A horrific deep structural shockwave reverberated through the hull. Over the open comms channel, sounds bled through 24 heavily armed pirates, suddenly subjected to 40 times Earth's gravity. No screens. Just the sickening wet collapse of heavy armor like tin cans, followed by catastrophic structural failure of the pirate ship's forward boarding tube. The magnetic vice grip shorted out. Freed from our clamps and propelled by reverse thrusters, the Starwalker violently tore away from the crippled Syndicate vessel. Through the shattered viewport, I finally saw the Bloodfang. Its forward section was completely caved in, venting atmosphere, debris, and a mist of frozen blood into the vacuum of space. The fearsome pirate cruiser drifted utterly dead in the water. Thomas stared at the wreckage. He didn't cheer. He just reached up, took off his glasses, and rubbed his eyes with trembling, blood-stained hands. Threat neutralized, Captain, he whispered. Then the man who had just dismantled an entire Syndicate boarding party and crippled a warship simply folded. His knees gave out. He collapsed onto the bridge deck in a dead faint, utterly consumed by the biochemical toll of his own humanity. It took 3 standard galactic days for a Coalition dreadnought to answer our distress beacon. During that time, the Starwalker limped toward the nearest relay station. The crew spent those days in solemn, terrified awe. We buried our dead, patched our hull, and tried to process what we had witnessed. When the Coalition investigators finally boarded, they took one look at the carnage, the shattered vertebrae, the dismembered limbs, the frozen corpses, and immediately assumed we had been carrying a covert squad of genetically modified super soldiers. I was sitting in the medical bay when the lead investigator, a rigid, highly decorated avian species named Commander Rail, came to interview us. He looked at his datapad, then at Thomas, who was lying in a medical cot wrapped in 2 thick thermal blankets, sneezing violently. Thomas had caught a rhinovirus from the sudden temperature drop when he blew the coolant pipe. His nose was bright red, his eyes watery, clutching a box of tissues like a lifeline. You expect me to believe, Commander Rail said, his beak clicking in skepticism, that this Terran eliminated 5 Syndicate enforcers in close combat, captured Marcus the Flayer alive, and crippled a warship? Thomas let out a pathetic wet cough. Excuse me, he mumbled, blowing his nose loudly. Can we turn the ambient heat up? It's freezing in here. He did, I said softly, stepping forward. My broken wrist was now encased in a sleek white medical cast. I placed my good hand on Thomas's shoulder. Every word in the captain's log is true. Rail stared at Thomas, struggling to reconcile the tactical reports with the sneezing, shivering man in front of him. The Coalition has classified Earth as a death world, Rail muttered, almost to himself. We assumed it was because of the apex predators, the tectonic instability, the microscopic pathogens. We never realized the most dangerous thing on the planet was the dominant species. We aren't monsters, Commander, Thomas said quietly. We just adapt to our environment. When the environment is peaceful, We are peaceful. But when the environment demands a monster, he looked away, staring at the sterile white wall. The monster is always there, waiting. The investigator left shortly after, clearly unsettled. When we were finally alone, I sat on the edge of his cot. I thought about the first time we met, how he had shyly asked me to help him carry a heavy database server, how I had spent 4 years shielding him from crowded corridors and rowdy cantinas. "You don't have to pretend anymore, Thomas," I said softly, brushing hair from his sweaty forehead. "You don't have to act weak for me." Thomas looked up at me, his brown eyes filled with sudden, desperate vulnerability. He reached out with his trembling, warm hand and grasped my good hand tightly. "Serena, I wasn't pretending," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You don't understand. The gravity here is light to me, but I do bruise easily. I do get sick from the air filters. My bones did break when I dropped that tool. Humans are physically fragile compared to you. Our bodies are soft. But on Earth, because our bodies were soft, our minds had to become weapons. Our nervous systems had to evolve to override our own fragility, pumping us full of chemicals that let us tear our own muscles off the bone just to survive. It's a curse, Serena." He squeezed my hand, pulling it to his chest. "When I left the Coalition military, I was hollowed out. I was a ghost. I came to the stars because I wanted to be soft. I wanted to be gentle. I wanted to be the man who reads books in gardens and gets cold." A tear slipped down his cheek. "When I met you, and you stood in front of me to protect me, it was the first time in my entire life someone looked at me and didn't see a weapon. You saw someone worth protecting. You anchored me to my own humanity. You didn't make me weak, Serena. You made me human again." She thought she was protecting him. He was hiding from himself. I stared at him, the profound truth washing over me. He hadn't been hiding behind me because he was afraid of the galaxy. He had been hiding behind me because he was afraid of himself. I was his shield against the darkness inside his own DNA. I leaned down and kissed his warm, soft cheek. "I will always protect you, Thomas," I murmured against his skin. "Always." He smiled, a genuine, gentle smile that reached his eyes. "I know, and I'll always be right behind you." He sniffled, shivering slightly. "But seriously, Serena, can you ask Dr. Chun for another blanket? I'm absolutely freezing." I let out a wet laugh, wiping my own tears. The monster was back in its cage, locked away behind wire-rimmed glasses, a love for terrible sweaters, and an immune system that surrendered to a stiff breeze. The galaxy was vast, dangerous, and filled with terrors. But as I tucked the thermal blanket under my human husband's chin, I knew one thing for certain. No matter what lurked in the dark void of space, the most dangerous, beautiful, and terrifying force in the universe was sleeping soundly in my arms. What an absolute journey. If you made it to the end of this HFY Sci-Fi story, you know exactly how terrifyingly awesome humanity can be when pushed to the edge. The galaxy thought Thomas was just a fragile husband made of glass. But glass can cut you to the bone when it shatters. If you loved this story and want more epic tales of humans proving every alien wrong, do me a favor. Smash that like button to feed the algorithm. Share this video with your sci-fi loving friends. And hit subscribe with the notification bell turned on for Winds of Thought so you never miss a new story. Drop a comment below and let me know. What would you do if you discovered your quiet, gentle partner was actually a retired Earth Coalition super soldier?